Hi everyone, my name is Alex Blumenfeld. I'm studying economics and math in CIS, and today I'd like to talk to you about industry concentration and regional business cycles. So right off the bat, I'd like to say a big thank you to my advisor, Professor Yohei Miyauchi, in the economics department in CIS. This project really could not have happened without all of his support over the past year. So just to get things started, I think we can all agree that a pretty defining feature of the American economy is that we all recognize some cities for being very specialized in particular industries. So think of historically maybe Detroit with the auto industry or Pittsburgh with steel, and today maybe San Francisco with the tech sector or even Boston with healthcare. So this question of whether cities choose to really specialize in one flagship industry or try to maintain a more diversified economy brings up a lot of interesting economic questions. And some of the theory we have for understanding these questions goes as far back as thinkers like Jane Jacobs, who was one of the first people to argue that having a really well-diversified economy in a city is great for long-term growth because innovation happens when industries share ideas between them. So having lots of different industries working together in the same urban environment is going to encourage a lot more long-term economic growth than depending on just one dominant industry. So I'm going to try to expand this line of thinking today by looking into the macroeconomic effects of this concept of industry concentration or diversification on two main variables, both just levels of economic growth, so that's GDP growth, and business cycle fluctuations, so that's more like the magnitude of expansions and recessions throughout the business cycle. So first off, we need to ask, how are we going to measure this concept of this extent to which a city depends on its largest firms? So we're going to do this using employment data at the metropolitan statistical area or MSA level. Each of those there are about 400 of them in the US. Each of them is just a set of counties arranged around one central city. So we have all of this employment data, and for each city, we're going to compute a measure called a Herfindahl index, which is just the sum of the squared employment shares of each industry in that city. So this index value ranges from 0 to 1. 0 means there are infinitely many industries. The city's perfectly diversified in terms of its industry mix. 1 means perfectly concentrated. There's only one industry, and it employs everyone. So I have a little map here of just the Herfindahl index values for all the MSAs in the United States. You can see that they're all somewhere between those extremes of 0 and 1. And one trend we're immediately going to notice is that bigger cities, just in terms of population, tend to have more diversified economies, so lower values of this index. And that's something we're going to have to control for in all of the analysis here. So speaking of that analysis, both of our main outcomes today have to do with the general idea of regional business cycles, so looking at both cities' underlying economic growth trends, as well as just the fluctuations around that trend. So noise that in the real world we observe as expansions and recessions that sort of move a city away from its steady state economic growth rate. So our first big result here is going to concern the trend portion of business cycles. So is there any relationship between industry concentration, which we have our index on the x-axis here, and just mean GDP growth rates for cities over the past 2 decades on the y-axis? So I won't make you read the whole regression table, but the main result is that just the first regression here, there's a negative significant relationship between this industry concentration measure and GDP growth. So cities with higher levels of industry concentration that depend more on their large industries tend to grow more slowly. But the unfortunate thing is, when we try out a couple different linear regression models, try to control for some basic omitted variables that could be related to industry concentration, we lose that statistical significance. So we seem to have roughly qualitatively confirmed the whole Jane Jacobs idea of well-diversified cities seem to grow a little faster than poorly diversified cities, but the results aren't super strong. Where things get more interesting is when we look at the impact of that same industry concentration measure here on the x-axis on fluctuations in cities' business cycles. And for that, our outcome as a variable is going to be variance of log GDP over the past 2 decades. So we have to take logarithms of cities' GDP values just because big cities have economies that are exponentially larger than those of small cities, and we need them to all be on the same scale. And then we take the variance of each city's set of GDP data over the past 20 years to get a general idea of just the volatility in a city's output and the extent to which its output varies around what we think is some underlying growth trend. So we can see here, even when we try out a couple different regression models that try to control for different sets of emitted variables, we get, in all of these cases, a strong, statistically significant positive relationship between industry concentration and economic fluctuations. So what we're seeing is that cities that are more dependent on their large industries, that are more concentrated, tend to have a higher magnitude of ups and downs in their business cycles, so more extreme expansions and recessions. So now we should naturally ask, since this is a pretty interesting result, why is this the case? So one simple explanation might just be there's some sort of law of large numbers thing going on, where in cities that are really well diversified with lots of small industries, any shock to a single industry isn't important enough to impact the overall status of the city's economy as a whole. Whereas maybe in high concentration cities, the one large industry's effects on the overall city's output are greater. So to try to test this possibility, I set up a little simulation basically aimed at predicting GDP values for each city while controlling for any city-specific business cycle trends. So the idea is that now the only thing that determines a city's simulated GDP path is going to be its particular industry composition, which industries are largest and smallest in that city. So I made those simulated time paths of GDP data for each city, took the variance of each one, and we got the results in orange here. So we still have a statistically significant positive relationship between real industry concentration and simulated GDP variance, but we can see that the magnitude of that effect is a lot smaller than it is in the real data. So we have the case that in the actual data, the slope of the line of best fit from the scatter plot is a lot higher than what it is in the simulated data. So this is telling us that the thing we took out of the analysis in this GDP simulation, which was city-specific, geographically specific business cycle trends, must be pretty important, and that this whole law of large numbers story of, oh, everything just averages out in really well-diversified cities isn't totally holding up. So this is a pretty interesting result, and it tells us that some sort of idiosyncratic, city-specific business cycle trends must be important for determining why industry concentration is so important for with its strong effect on economic fluctuations. So just to wrap up, the main results we have today, number one, we saw a somewhat weak relationship between industry concentration and GDP growth, so more concentrated cities tending to have somewhat slower GDP growth over time. And then we saw a much stronger result telling us that cities that depend a lot on their large industries tend to have larger economic fluctuations, or they have at least over the past 20 years. And we saw that just kind of the mathematical averaging of shocks to supposedly independent industries in well-diversified or poorly diversified cities can't totally explain the extent of the relationship we saw. So naturally, we have to ask, more generally, what other interesting things happen when there's one really large dominant industry present in the city? There's some prior research that suggests that maybe what happens is that one large industry becomes really closely linked with the other small industries in the city through maybe like supplier linkages. So one shock to the big industry can really easily propagate through the whole economy and cause a lot of volatility in the city's overall output. But this is something that we need a lot more theory and data work to really understand. And more generally, the question we have should be pretty much, what are the pros and cons of encouraging city-level policymakers to either try to make their city into a hub for some particular industry, try to attract an Amazon headquarters or give big tax breaks to attract a factory, or potentially trying to encourage them to build more diversified economies. So it seems that the whole Jane Jacobs idea of more industry diversity is better seems to be winning out in this analysis, but there's quite a lot more we need to do before I can give any actually good policy recommendations. So I'm hoping, this is a huge topic, but I'm hoping that the research I've done will at least make a small contribution towards trying to understand this important area of research. So that's all I've got. I would love to take some questions.
Questions for Alex?
Great work. First, I wanted to ask about, so you begin by saying, or your research question is about how like diversity or concentration of industries leads to economic growth.
Right.
And I understand how it leads to fluctuations, but how exactly, what's the connection between business cycle fluctuations and economic growth and like that you're making here?
The connection between fluctuations and growth?
Yeah.
Yeah, so pretty much, if you think of it from like the Fed's perspective, they're the ones governed with trying to control how the U.S.'s business cycles evolve. The general goal is, we want economies to grow at a somewhat rapid but stable rate. So the whole idea of like active monetary policy is we want to try to suppress these fluctuations in business cycles to make sure that cities have relatively steady growth over time. So noting that cities that don't have strong industry diversity tend to have more extreme, ups and downs in their business cycles is a pretty important result, because it tells us that those cities are, more vulnerable to big seesawing expansions and recessions, as opposed to the optimum we really want of, economic growth that's relatively steady over time without any big disruptions. Yeah.
Let me see if I can articulate my question well. But
Sure.
How do you see the role of globalization in the way you think about this problem? The reason I'm asking is that I have the feeling that I guess that cities with large industrial concentration, I think you're looking at the past 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken, right? You're looking at the past 2 decades. Places with industrial concentration tend to be places that are more linked with the global economy in the especially the past 2 decades.
Yeah.
Are the cycles in some way related to that factor?
So all my work here is just with US data, and I certainly thought, like what I was saying at the end about what sort of interesting structural changes happen, you have a really large industry present, I think could definitely be the case that maybe it's not that a large industry becomes really intertwined with the other supporting industries around it locally, but that it could make, a city's output more vulnerable to like external international shocks. And that's why cities have their own business cycles that seem to be diverging from what happens nationally. But I definitely don't have enough analysis just in this project to really give a great answer to how globalization affects this.
So just a naive curiosity-driven question. This index, I forgot the name of it, I'm sorry. All of the graphs, you don't go much above 0.2, is that fair? And I was just wondering, is that just typical of the US? If I go somewhere else, does that change? Or what does that tell us, if anything?
So I can't say much about the US. So the reason I chose this metric is that when you use firms as like the individual units instead of industries, this is one of the things that the Justice Department uses in like antitrust litigation to decide how concentrated like a product market is. So they have their own benchmarks about, if it's above 0.25 or something, that means someone's inhibiting competition. But I haven't seen this used as much with industries as the unit of analysis. So there isn't a simple cutoff to say this is concentrated, this isn't, but there is at least some variation in it that we can exploit.
Any other questions for Alex? If not, let's give him another round of applause for a great talk.
Thank you very much.